I've got a cool one for you here today, an unopened, brand new, original copy of one of the greatest sims of all time. I think Ned Jarrett said it best.
I'm Ned Jarrett from Papyrus. This is NASCAR Racing.
NASCAR Racing, retroactively known as NASCAR Racing 1, was developer Papyrus's foray into the world of stock cars, beginning with this title and featuring almost yearly installments up to the release of the coveted NASCAR Racing 2003. The NASCAR Racing series DNA lives on today with many of the same development teams still working on iRacing. But this was the original NASCAR Racing, released back in the fall of 1994 at the end of one of my favorite periods in stock car racing. It covered the 1994 season with 25 licensed drivers and 9 of the season's tracks. Followed up later with the official track pack expansion, adding in the remaining Winston Cup calendar outside the coveted Indianapolis and Daytona speedways. NASCAR Racing released about a year after Papyrus's IndyCar Racing and built upon the same base engine which had its roots back to the original 1989 Indianapolis 500. If you've played these sims, you can see how they each built upon each other and continually added new features. All of the sims from Indy 500 through really NASCAR 3 have the same bones, similar physics and graphic engines with small improvements between them. It wasn't until 1998's Grand Prix Legends and eventually NASCAR Racing 4 that Papyrus unveiled their updated physics engine that really took the sim racing world by storm. But that was all to come in the future. For this edition though, it was the high-resolution SVGA graphics that were a major advancement over the earlier IndyCar Racing and Indy 500 sims. Most computers could barely run them at the time and had to opt for the lower 320 by 200 VGA resolution, but for the fortunate few who could, whereas computers rapidly advanced in the coming years, the high-resolution 640 by 480 was a significant upgrade over earlier sims. And since racing stock cars was often done in close quarters, Papyrus overhauled their AI system from IndyCar 1. The AI in NASCAR, while far from perfect, allowed you to rub fenders, bump draft, and fight for position in full fields of up to 39 AI at the larger tracks, again, as long as your computer could handle it. NASCAR Racing 1 was the entry point for many with online racing as well. Maybe hard to imagine, but 27 years ago, Papyrus launched what was known as the Hawaii servers and allowed sim racers from all over the world to literally dial in and race together online. There are many stories of massive phone bills racked up from the late-night online races. NASCAR 1 was truly a phenomenon and even attracted attention from real-world drivers who had become advocates for sim racing like Bobby Labonte and Dale Earnhardt Jr.
Let's go practice our driving style.
Although NASCAR Racing was mainly a North American activity, because of its advanced graphics, physics, and unheard of online competition, NASCAR Racing 1 went global and amassed over 1 million copies sold, paving the way for Papyrus to continue on a PlayStation version, as well as the even more successful follow-up, NASCAR Racing 2, in 1996. So this is a brand new copy of NASCAR Racing, I believe from 1994, although we're going to find out. I think it's one of the first releases. I'm really curious to see what the version is on it. And I picked it up off of eBay. It's not too hard to find copies of this, just loose CDs or the CD in the manual. You can also find box copies without too much of an issue, but finding a new in-box copy, they're there, but they're kind of pricey. And finally one showed up that wasn't so expensive, so I decided to pick it up. I've never had a full box copy of NASCAR Racing, and I'm excited to open it to see what's inside. The artwork itself for this game is so iconic, and it's definitely a composite image. Like how it always looked like the 22 is actually in 2 spots in the image, and definitely, my guess is it's Darlington actually in the background, but definitely a made-up wall and crowd, and Jeff Gordon's car is absolutely sat on top of an image there, but great looking cover, makes you want to jump in and try out some of the stock cars. Got to remember, Jeff Gordon was the new big driver in 1994, his second full-time season, went on to win the Brickyard 400, and although that track's not included, Indianapolis Motor Speedway, he was definitely becoming the face of the sport. So this is the CD-ROM version of the game as it says up there, and I believe the game was available in floppy as well. It was later made for Mac, I believe, and of course a PlayStation version. But the CD-ROM version was by far the most distributed, and it came out in 1994 as well. It was the only way to get the SVGA graphics, which, like I said in the beginning, weren't able to run on many computers at the time, at least without reducing a lot of other details or how many opponents you were racing. So many folks raced at regular VGA at first before computers started speeding up, and really once Pentiums came around, it was pretty easy to run SVGA overall. I like how it includes also that we have 2 music tracks that we can play on our audio CD player. Since CDs themselves were still considered quite new and exciting in 1994, it was kind of fun to have, I guess, some music on the disc as well. So on the side of the box here, confirming CD-ROM version has some of the specs. Be easier to take a look at once we get it unwrapped. It's still vacuum wrapped and everything sealed. I believe it's the original. I went to take a look back at a video I did a while ago of unboxing a copy of Grand Prix Legends, and I'm not convinced that copy was new, but taking a look at this one in the corners and stuff on the box, I do genuinely think this is a brand new version of the game, never been opened before. So be interesting to unpeel that, I guess, 28-year-old wrapping around it. But it requires a double spin CD-ROM drive. For VGA, you need a 386. 486 was definitely needed for the SVGA. And really, once Pentiums, like I said, came around, that was the thing that you really wanted. Recommended joystick or driving wheel pedal combo. I guess the Thrustmaster would have been around at this time, but definitely I was playing this on the keyboard in 1994, as many folks were, and then graduated to a joystick, I think, with NASCAR 2 for myself. It was quite a while before wheels became commonplace. So on the back of the box here, some of the marketing things: the fastest stock cars on earth and you behind the wheel. The screenshot there at Martinsville was always kind of the poster child track. You see it in the introduction for the game and in a lot of the promotional materials. And it's funny because, in my opinion, it's one of the least accurate tracks that there is and one of the hardest to race around. So it's always interesting that they use that, but maybe because it was smaller, it was a little easier to run on computers of the time. So some of the other marketing blurbs: ever put your foot down on 700 horsepower or enter a corner at 200 miles an hour bumper to bumper with the car ahead of you? If you want to feel the real thing, you're in for an experience of a lifetime. We certainly were. I like the highlights of it. Music is the #1 highlight overall. So really highlighting that music is included with this. We've got 2 songs, and I never knew that the song itself was written specifically for this. I guess I could have assumed that, but Race Riff was a digitized music track by Rachel Bolan and Dave Snake Sabo of Skid Row. So that's the song that you hear in the introduction to the game, which is quite fun. And we also have The Fastest Sport by The Fat Man that we can play on our CD player. Of course, had multiplayer here. It says 2 can play. This was when the box came out, was a little bit before the Hawaii servers and everything started being run. So it's just 2-player multiplayer connecting via IP address. We've got accidents and damage, never a dull moment. I think that's one of the things that NASCAR Racing really has over the IndyCar racing sims. You're meant to race close in NASCAR, and so side by side you can bump the AI a bit more, so the closer racing and things was absolutely true. Game's incredibly realistic. We've got hot setups. It's authentic. There's an arcade option, which can't go understated, I guess. It's really just setup options to be arcade, but that's interesting. We've got a car editor, which was a huge deal and still is to these days, to custom paint your car. A completely separate application included to paint your car. You can actually see a screenshot of it down here. We'll take a look in a second, but was a huge deal. Launched hundreds, if not thousands, of folks that painted cars as their main activity with NASCAR racing. That continues to this day. Then lastly, of course, SVGA graphics, kind of burying the lead. I might have put that one up top, but 640 by 480 was considered high resolution, if you can imagine, in the time. So we got some of the other blurbs here. I like the screenshots that are included. It's just interesting what they decide to highlight on the box. You have to remember, this box would have been available in some of the big box stores, so you could walk up and find this on the shelf, take a look at the back, and decide if you wanted to pick it up or not. So what they actually put on the box itself was very important in these days. You could almost think of it nowadays as in Steam and how things are marketed on there. But yeah, we can pick the competition, select our track, Of course, only 9 tracks included with this release, and we'll look at some of those with the track pack later. Pretty much the whole schedule, and since then with some of the mods, you can actually race on the full schedule. We've got our car setups and driving conditions. I don't think they highlighted on the box, but there were night races, and Night Bristol is one of those. Night racing was pretty new in NASCAR in 1994. They had just started racing at Charlotte at night, and the Coke 600 was run at night, but that's not one of the tracks. Charlotte, surprisingly, is not one of the tracks that's included by default in NASCAR 1. It's part of the track pack, and it does have the night edition there, but we do have Atlanta, Bristol, Darlington, Loudon, Martinsville, Michigan, Phoenix, Talladega, and Watkins Glen. Not such a bad selection of tracks. I always thought that Papyrus included Loudon in everything, because for one, they would have had the track built from IndyCar 1, and 2, they are a company based in New England, as they are today in Massachusetts, so that's the closest track to them. Probably wanted that included in their sims. All right, so we'll open it up here and peel away the shrink wrap that's been on for so many years. Feels almost dirty to do. There are plenty of these boxes out there for collectors. I like looking through the manuals and things, which is half the reason I buy it. So it's the reason I do want to unwrap it. But there it goes, unboxed, unsealed for the first time. Looks like we have a little type of tag included with the packaging. Interesting. This box overall is in really good condition. I got a little crumple in the top right. That could have been from shipping or something, but overall, no real scratches or anything like that. So try to keep it that way. We'll open her up and take a look at what's inside. I genuinely don't know exactly what's inside the box here. I have seen scans of the manual and things, but as far as actually knowing everything that's included, I have no idea. All right, so we'll go in order of how things are included. So we have the manual. Look how thick the manual is. This is from the time where you really needed to and wanted to read the manual. I remember buying so many games, so many PC games specifically back in the day, where on the ride home from the store, you'd be tearing through the manual, and it was kind of like your encyclopedia to whatever the game was, and read every single page of it while you're not playing if you couldn't use the computer or something. So many interesting things included in there. We've got some sort of insert here we'll pull out. Couple things included. We'll take a look through the manual in a second. Might as well look at this stuff first. We got some information for Windows 95 users. How to install NASCAR Racing under Windows 95. Tells you how to set up your sound cards. Running it under Windows 95. Probably included that since so many folks were upgrading at the time from DOS to Windows 95. Or Windows 95 was a lot of folks' first way that they used a computer. It was much more accessible than DOS was. All right, we've got a racing keyboard reference. This is pretty awesome. I don't know if I've seen this before in scans or anything online, but something might be useful to make a copy of and have next to me as I do things. Got all our keys included here. So driving keys, radio information. These are all the F boxes, of course, to pop up your different things that you can take a look at and change, and tells you how to navigate all those menus, which is pretty cool. It's fun to look at these if you've played these games a lot, because you always learn something that you didn't know was maybe possible that can add some excitement to the sim. General controls to navigate the menus. Of course, no mouse support in NASCAR 1, so it's all keyboard to navigate all the menus, and then graphics detail options. We've got here a troubleshooting guide. This is, I think, your normal one for DOS. This is going to tell you how to run the game from DOS and install it. Includes information on how to set it up. All pretty standard stuff once you've set up one of these games, but you probably come back here after just trying to do it without looking at the manual, and if you have some issues, you would come take a look through something like this. Tells you here how to improve performance. You may want to turn some of your textures off or auto in the graphics menu. I always like that they included the auto option, so as the frame rate dips, it can actually turn things on and off. This is interesting for novice drivers. If you are just starting out at driving computer simulations and would like to be more competitive with the computer cars without practicing for many hours, there are a number of settings that may be customized. The first to do is to decrease the opponent's strength. That's kind of cheating, isn't it? Interesting stuff. All of this would have been new. You know, it's not hard to imagine that this was many folks' first racing sim. It's not like you're installing Assetto Corsa after you've been playing R Factor for years. You maybe had never tried something that wasn't an arcade game before. So all of those things are important. Now this is the good stuff. A nice little catalog. Does this fold out? Oh yeah. So here you go, a Thrustmaster, slide my box back, Thrustmaster ad from 1994. No matter your brand of racing, whether it be sports cars. Got a Group C there. I think that's an IndyCar, actually, I believe. Maybe Formula One. No, it's Emerson Fittipaldi, so it would have been an IndyCar. It looks like a 94. Actually, we got the Thrustmaster. Is that the T1? Yeah, the Formula T1. So that was kind of the premier wheel. No force feedback. Force feedback wasn't a thing. I get this question all the time. Wasn't a thing until around 1998, at least with the simulators. Grand Prix Legends was patched to include force feedback. This had some good old bungee cords. I think Chris Hay has a pretty cool video on a similar wheel from the time, if not this exact one, that I recommend checking out. Got a nice picture of stock cars here. He might actually do the T1 itself, but stick shift included, sequential. This is what you would have raced on if you really had a nice setup back in the day. Nothing on the back, but that's cool. A nice little Thrustmaster ad. It'd be cool to get an old wheel like that to experience it as it was, but you can get these games working on modern equipment these days. And here we go. Go for it. We can win a Pentium chip, which would have been a huge deal. That's what you really needed to run this game at max, as we'll see it today. All right, so then we got the manual itself, and the only other thing in the box is the CD, the jewel case CD. Open that up in a second. Still sealed. Notice the boxes. Papyrus did this with a lot of their games. On the outside, much thicker than on the inside. It's just it's kind of a cardboard insert to make everything sit towards the top. But that was so it took the proper amount of space on the shelf. You didn't want a small looking box because that means the game wasn't as good if you were looking in the store. So here's the manual. Such an awesome manual. There are full scans of this manual available online. So just taking a look at the Watertown, Massachusetts, not too far from where I live, actually. But there's full scans of this manual online. I'll put a link in the description, so I won't flip through every single page here, but we'll get a taste for what's included in a game manual like this, and stuff that is just very awesome. I'm sure is included in some of the PDFs and things today, but having this alongside at your desk, or when you weren't able to use the computer, something to flip through and learn a little bit about. It felt like some sort of guide to stock car racing as a whole, not just this NASCAR racing game. But take a look. Papyrus Design Group, 1994. A table of contents. So we got a section just around the basics of on track and the cockpit and all that stuff. Game menu functions, all your different settings. So this is all the stuff you'd expect to be in a manual. But then we've got track guides for every single track. We'll have to see who comments on them in here, but I know in some of the later games, Bobby Labonte did some of these NASCAR circuits, so a guide through every track, and they're not just a single page. If you notice, they're at least a couple pages each. Try not to bend this thing. We've got a guide on preparing to win, garage menu, bunch of pages about how to actually set up your car. We've got American history, the evolution of stock car racing. That chapter will be good for me. And then some appendices, how to use the paint kit. NASCAR Winston Cup champions. I'm not sure they could have used Winston Cup, but forgot to edit it there in the manual. Then we've got an index. So we've got the quick glance guide. These manuals always included just a quick process for how to get started. These days, the sims, you take a look at like Codemasters Formula One sim, they'll jump you into some sort of training right as you boot up the game. And those types of things just weren't possible back in 1994. So this will guide you through how to choose a preseason testing round at Talladega and then walk you through just the very basics about how to drive. Interestingly enough, we've got a picture of the front screen there, which looks very different from the one that we see when we boot up the sim. Some overview on the cockpit itself and all the gauges. And here's what you like to see, a nice reading walkthrough of how to drive around a track. Talladega in this sim has that 90-degree kink coming down the front straightaway, so I'm not sure if this talks you through how to make sure you get through that, but noticeably tighter than real life. Here's talks you through how to do all the different settings to change your tires and how to set up your pit stops, add wedge and spoiler. I know coming from IndyCar 2, which was the sim I played quite a lot more than this, and going back and forth between them, they're very similar sims, but some of the options are different. Obviously, you've got a spoiler in NASCAR Racing where you've got wing settings in IndyCar 2 and the wedge and everything, so different adjustments you had to learn about. You've got a better picture of that main menu, different background image, so maybe they updated that over time. I'll have to see what type of background image this version has. Here we go. Note to mouse users, NASCAR Racing does not include mouse support. It's not that mouse support wasn't possible in DOS, but they just didn't build this game to have it. So then we have the page on the arcade driving views. So I was wrong. It's both the view that you could change as well as there were setups called arcade that just made the car a lot easier to drive. But there's no specific mode for it. I know these were heavily contested that if you raced in the arcade driving view from the outside of the car that you weren't a real racer, but do whatever you like. They're kind of cool that you can see the car from a distance. So we got some information here on the replay modes. I always thought Papyrus did a great job with their replay controls all the way through NASCAR 2003 and in iRacing too. Just the customization options and saving replays, cutting them, always made sure that you'd be able to view all the action that you had. So I'm going to get to the actual track guides, and Atlanta Motor Speedway up front, the natural oval, no front stretch dogleg in this version. This includes a lot of information about the track itself, and we've got NASCAR driver Joe Nemechek here to talk us through preparing a car for Atlanta. Then on the next page, we've got Dave Marcus to tell us about how to actually find the line. This is the type of stuff in the manual that's even fun to read these days and learn about these different tracks. Got all the original tracks here, and I could only imagine in the track pack they actually talk through the rest of them as well. We've got Darlington here, which might be the most questionable rendition of any track in the game. Once again, Joe Nemechek talking us through how to set up a car, and Dave Marcus through driving. So that's awesome. They got Dave Marcus, a legend of the sport, to explain how to actually drive around each of these tracks. So then we've got the page about Talladega, and Talladega was absolutely the most raced track, especially online. But for anybody that booted this up, it was just a lot easier than the rest of the tracks, and big and wide open. And of course, the front straightaway kink there, which looks pretty severe in this picture. So maybe that's what they built the track off of. But that was a challenging part to go flat out through, but an easier track to do the drafting and everything. And I remember online there being so many add-ons for the AI to try to get them to race better here, because everybody liked racing Talladega. And without Daytona existing, Talladega really was the super speedway included. And then, of course, Watkins Glen being the only road circuit. I'm sure the international crowd that maybe didn't understand oval racing as much took many, many laps around Watkins Glen. I remember it being the one I avoided generally because it was just more difficult than the ovals were. So let me talk through some of the different things that can happen with a stock car with understeering or having a push condition. Got the oversteer and the spin, so that'll show you how the car can lose grip. All the basic stuff. And again, this was many folks' first sim, so this just wasn't stuff that you would know unless you were an actual race driver. So it's all really good information to be included, and I guarantee you, even as the seasoned veterans that you all are these days, I bet if you read this, you might pick up a thing or two that you didn't know. A lot of pages, though, about setting up the car. Just flick through some of them really quick, but everything that you'd want to know about every setting and what it does. I might actually read this again. I'm sure I read it at some point in the past, but it could teach me a thing or two. So we get towards the back and we have the history section, which for me is one of the most exciting parts. But starting off right at the beginning with the Hudson Hornet, Daytona Beach, it's such a pity that they couldn't work things out with Sega to actually get Daytona, because that's really the only thing missing from the stock sim. And although we have it these days, the first version of Daytona that wasn't just a reskin Talladega didn't really appear until much, much later. I think the NASCAR 3 version of the circuit that finally came out in 2000 really was the first. That ended up being converted down to NASCAR 2 and then NASCAR 1, and that's the one we have today. So from the time this sim launched in 1994 through 2000, there really wasn't a version of Daytona to race on. But we still had fun with it anyway. Birthplace of speed here. We've got Sir Malcolm Campbell and his Bluebird on a speed run, breaking the speed record in the 1930s, which is so cool. I believe that's the car that's on the Daytona 500 trophy these days. And it's neat that it all kind of ties back to these original speed runs. It ended up moving to Utah and the Salt Flats, of course. Talks you through the whole history, though, all the way back on the dirt oval. Some great photos included in here. You know, Papyrus didn't have to include any of this stuff, but it was kind of normal for games at the time to just include a big manual, and I'm upset that games have gotten away from that, but it's the way things have gone. So then finally in the back we get up to the paint shop and the manual, and this was the place that many folks hung out and became maybe the sole reason that they played NASCAR Racing or any of the NASCAR Racing games. Papyrus, from the beginning, I think, recognized that folks wanted to paint their own cars or paint cars and share them, and made that a priority in their sims to include. And it's one of the things that's often an afterthought in games these days. I've seen so many sims that it's really difficult to update skins for cars, or maybe not even possible. And it's surprising, because painting cars is a fun thing to do, and a lot of folks get a lot of enjoyment out of that. But a great manual covering the game, and one that definitely we'll be reading more of. Like I said, there's scans of this online, so you can easily page through it yourself or find your own copy on eBay. All right, so we've got the jewel case as well here. Try not to scratch it at all, but just need to get through some of this clear. All right, there we go. Unwrap our jewel case. Now, it's just going to be the CD inside, but I'm interested to see, it should say what version of the game this is, and interested to see if it's actually a very original release or one of the patched versions. Back in the 90s, it wasn't that easy to go online and update a game, or it certainly didn't happen automatically. And so often you would actually see folks buying the same game over again to get patched versions of it. We can actually see here it's version 1.21. So this is a patched version of the game. So it's not the original release, but you do want the patched version. These days, the Sierra site that has the patches is actually still active online, so you can go download them. But I believe they fixed some yellow flag errors and AI problems and things with the patches, so you definitely wanted them. We'll take a look at the CD itself. Here it is in all its glory. We've got CD without a scratch on it from behind. I think they're only using just a tiny bit of it. I don't know if it'll pick it up on the video itself, but not too much data written to the disc. Got some instructions here about how to run it, and funny enough, it talks about how you need to skip the first track if you put this in a CD player to listen to the songs. Over here, more specific directions. You got to skip track 1 because that's the track that has the game on it. Do not play track 1 in your audio player. It contains the NASCAR Racing game. But track 2 is Race Riff, and track 3 is the Fastest Sport. So overall, a really nice package included with NASCAR Racing. In an era where you weren't getting a new game weekly or even monthly, a lot to look at here, a lot to sink your teeth into, and a very nice package overall. Just everything included is absolute quality. So with the game running now and on the home screen, jump down to the driver's info screen to start things off. This is where you could customize your driver, and you've got venerable John Smith there in the 94 Lumina. I always like this paint scheme a lot, and it's actually been recreated in iRacing and NASCAR 2003 for different mods and things. A favorite of mine, a classic. 94 for the year, I guess, that it came out. But the driver info screen would let you change all of the different details about the driver to make him yourself. So you can change the name to be whoever you are, nickname, put a team in, hometown. All of these settings don't really do anything. I guess name will change what your name is in the standings, but they did away with the name at the top of the pit board that pops up every lap, being the nickname in IndyCar 1. So as far as I know, nickname is only for this settings screen. Likewise, team and hometown, I guess, are just flavor. All of the drivers have it set up, and they added a lot more of that with NASCAR 2 and the future NASCAR sims with full bios and photos and all of that stuff that I love. You could then pick from your chassis, and I'm pretty sure it's licensed with Chevy, Ford, Pontiac. I'm pretty sure they have different driving qualities, although I haven't seen, maybe it's in the manual describing exactly what the different feeling is, something they copied over from IndyCar Racing to make the chassis handle slightly differently. It's funny, it's actually on Ford, even though the car looks like a Chevy. It doesn't change the look of the car at all. You'd have to do that in the paint shop. And then for tires, this was high time for the tire war in NASCAR. So you can pick between Goodyear and Hoosier, and that does change how the car looks. And I know from just racing experience, this does change how the car drives. The Hoosier tires, I think, a bit more grippy for a shorter amount of time than the Goodyear's, better over the whole run. So jumping down to look at opponents, the opponents list is interesting because, like the marketing materials say, there's 25 or so featured drivers from NASCAR, but there's a lot of fictional drivers, and you'd be surprised who's missing overall. If we look, starting off as your teammate with Fred Jones, your teammate throughout all of the Papyrus sims. It's great to see him here. We've got Rick Mast driving the one car. It would have been the Skull-sponsored car, but no tobacco. Sponsorships in NASCAR Racing 1, so I'm not even sure what that says. Precision Products Racing, it looks like. And second up, you've got Rusty Wallace in the number 2 for Penske. Should have been Miller Genuine Draft car, but Ford Motorsports looks like here. And Rusty had the most wins of the 1994 season. I think he won something near 10 races, maybe 8 or 9 races on the season, but came up short. It was all about consistency in the 1990s. And moving up next, we'll jump over to Sterling Marlin in the number 4. And if you've noticed, the numbers are actually in order for the driver selection, and we've skipped number 3. Dale Earnhardt is not included in NASCAR Racing 1 by default, and it's probably the biggest omission, although there's a couple of them, but he was quickly added in by folks painting cars, and the cars that were painted very much looked the part, so a lot of folks probably think he was included. And I should mention that this is the US version of the game that has the real drivers. There was a totally separate version, I believe the one sold in Europe specifically, that had none of the real drivers, maybe for licensing reasons. So this one had some of the real drivers, but missing some of the big ones like Dale Earnhardt. But Sterling Marlin here in the Morgan McClure racing car, very successful in this time period as well. We'll move on. Terry Labonte with the Kellogg scheme. For me, these are some of the most classic NASCAR paint schemes that there are from the early to mid 90s. And then Mark Martin finishing second in points to Dale Earnhardt in the Valvoline number 6 for Roush Racing. Another great looking car. I think the Valvoline colors, red, white, and blue, go well on any kind of car. Skip on over to Jeff Bodine then in the number 7 Exide car. Always like this paint scheme as well. The paint schemes themselves I think look really nice, especially if you ever tried to paint any yourselves. Even with importing and exporting files, it takes a certain kind of art to paint something with so few pixels that represents the real thing. So although it might look grainy to you here looking at them, it's quite impressive what they were able to do with very, very small templates for all the cars. You got Jeff Burton in the number 8. A lot of folks won't remember him racing the Stavola brothers car. Ted Musgrave in the family number 16 car. Got Loy Allen Jr. in the number 19. Loy Allen, an ill-fated career to say the least. Then we've got Leroy Britton in the number 21. Who, don't worry, you're not going crazy. Leroy Britton is an absolutely made-up name as far as I know. Morgan Shepherd drove for the Wood brothers in 1994, but I guess they got licensed to use the car, but not the driver. So we've got Leroy Britton. Wonder if that counts to the 25 or not. Bobby Labonte in the 22, who's on the box cover there twice, but liked this car too, the Maxwell House 22. But then we've got Jeff Gordon in the Rainbow 24 for DuPont Racing, Hendrick Motorsports. This is his classic iconic scheme, right? It's replicated pretty well here. The numbers on all the cars are kind of big, but if you think about racing the cars, you want the numbers to be as big as possible as you're trying to pass cars and see who you're passing, especially at the lower resolution. Got Brett Bodine then in the 26 car for King Racing. Love the Quaker State schemes from the time period as well. And then Ernie Irvin driving the 28 for Robert Yates Racing. This is another iconic scheme from the time period, of course associated heavily with Davey Allison, but raced many years afterwards, Ernie Irvin having the seat for a few years there. Michael Waltrip makes an appearance in the 30 Pennzoil car. This car in real life had yellow wheel rims, which I always liked a lot that they matched them. I'm kind of a sucker for any car that has colored wheel rims that match the paint scheme, but still represented pretty well here. You can forgive it for the time period. We got Ward Burton in the 31 Hardee's car, not one that you see too often these days, before moving over to the 22. And then Harry Gant, Mr. September, driving the 33, which should also be a Skull car, but just says Leo Jackson for Leo Jackson Motorsports on it. This is a great scheme, especially the real version, but even in this fictionalized Leo Jackson version, the colors are very nice. So I always liked the 33 cars, especially when they were Oldsmobiles just a few years earlier. And then Elton Sawyer's included in the 38 for Atkins Sutton Motorsports, which, if I'm not mistaken, was actually a Busch team for 1994, which the Xfinity these days. So included him in there to get another field filler, I suppose, but another car included that is a real life car, I believe. And then Joe Nemechek in the Meineke car. It's a nice paint scheme as well, often forgotten, I think, but Joe was always quick in qualifying. Front Row Joe is his nickname, but no poles in 1994. I think some of that came a bit later. And then Jeff Purvis in the 51 Country Time car, painted exactly like Neil Bonnet's car was, and I think he took over for Neil in this machine, but interesting paint scheme, definitely one that sticks out on track and a car you definitely won't miss. So then we got Ken Schrader in the 52, and I believe Ken Schrader was still driving for Hendrick Motorsports in 1994, so this might as well be his Busch car, I believe. I think it's his racing team that he fielded then. So another car that wouldn't have been in the Cup Series, but another real car to add to the field. And Jimmy Hensley driving what I always thought was actually a fictional car, but is a real car. It's maybe not the best representation of it here, and looks not quite as garish in real life as you see. So then we got what I believe is the first fictional car that's included for the 64 Food City car. Nice paint scheme overall, but not one that I believe raced in real life. After him, Dave Marcus, of course, in the manual has to be included in the game, driving the 71, the Olive Garden car, which he drove just, I believe, for a couple of years here. And then Mike Wallace for Junie Donlevy's 90 car. This car, very iconic from the time period as well, and love the color of it. They were actually able to get the color with the limited palette just being that kind of teal green, and so it's nice to see. Then we get to, I believe, the rest of the fictional cars with Joe McDermott here. We've got the 00 for Rachel Bolin, who I remember racing against so much back in the day. I ran with this default car set for years. I never even knew that there were online forums and things that had car sets and paint schemes to download. So I raced against these cars all the time. 09 car there, 25 car. Now, a lot of the tracks don't let you race against the full field of 39 cars, and so you would only see whatever the first ones are in the set. So if you are racing at Bristol or Martinsville, or you've turned down the number of opponents so your computer could perform better, you wouldn't have seen these cars on the track anyway. But a lot of fictional schemes included towards the back of the pack, and to pad out some of those bigger racetracks. So pretty good set for the default car set if you had this North America edition, but missing some big names. Dale Earnhardt, like we said, is not in there. Dale Jarrett, Kyle Petty, and Darrell Waltrip all missing. Definitely drivers that you would have noticed on normal Sundays. So pretty easy to remedy, and in fact, Papyrus kind of encouraged it with the paint kit and everything, but there were hundreds, if not thousands, of paint schemes available online, and still to this day you can download some car sets for this to race various years with all the real drivers from the 90s. Jumping then to the single race mode and take a quick swing through the tracks. These are the 9 tracks like we looked at on the box that are included, and all have track art, which is, I think, real photos that have been drawn over to create these images. I loved looking at them, and it just helped add some sort of being or a place, inspired you to race at some of these different tracks. But Atlanta here, the natural oval before it was reconfigured. You do have Bristol, which in quick race mode or single race mode is only available in the daytime, but there was a night version that you would get in the championship mode whenever you got to it. We have Darlington, the egg-shaped oval. Very interesting representation of it in NASCAR 1 by default. Certainly one of those that got redone. Loudon, of course, with the swamp in the middle still, as it was in the early 90s. These days it's all filled in and paved and everything for all the teams and garages. But for the first few years, it was still very natural in that area. We've got Martinsville, the paperclip oval is the one used in the intro video as well. Very wide on the straightaways, maybe too wide, but the track was quite a bit different back in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and certainly had more grass and things in the corners. Got the Michigan Speedway, which same version I believe that's included with IndyCar 1. It was revamped for IndyCar 2 and NASCAR 2, but the high-speed 2-mile oval was another fun track to race on when you weren't so great at racing. Included as well was Phoenix, and I have to think because of IndyCar Racing, this was included too. It's pretty much the same version that's included with IndyCar Racing, and Cup started going here in the late 80s, so it was a newer track at this time for NASCAR and was kind of an exciting venue. Featured quite heavily in Days of Thunder, so one that you definitely wanted to race at. And then everybody's favorite, Talladega with the big airstrip in the middle. Huge oval. You get kind of a sense of scale with this image, how skinny the road is going around compared to the other tracks. And like I said, the corner down the front straightaway, the kink, the dogleg, and the oval looks a little bit sharper than it is in real life from the angle here. So maybe that's why Papyrus made it so sharp. And lastly, Watkins Glen, the classic North American road circuit. They talk a lot in the manual about how historic this track is, and it wasn't for a few more years that they built Grand Prix Legends, but the NASCAR version of the track, so no boot or anything like that, much more like the track was in the 60s actually. NASCAR still to this day runs the same layout. So I'm flying around Atlanta, stuck up behind Jeff Gordon here, and I think Leroy Britton in the Wood Brothers car in front. I'm using my Fanatec modern racing equipment with this, and I have a tutorial that I did for IndyCar Racing 2 about how to set up modern controls and things with that. And all of that applies with this. I'm running on a modern PC with DOSBox, and it's kind of silly maybe to use the modern controls with it, but it actually works surprisingly well and makes it possible to control the game unlike ever was able to back in the day. I only ever really used the keyboard controls with NASCAR Racing 1, and I think it wasn't until NASCAR 2 or maybe NASCAR 3 that I switched over to using a joystick. It's easy to convince yourself that it's not so different until you actually do it. And these days, it's so much easier to get a wheel and pedals and things, especially for less money than it was back then, that it's pretty easy to get involved, but wheels felt kind of rare back in the day with stuff like this. But it's surprising how well it handles with the modern equipment. Now, of course, there is no force feedback. The steering rotation is set to pretty small, 300 degrees I run in NASCAR 1, but you do get a sense of visual control. You have to pay attention a lot more than you do in a modern sim, but after a while, after you get calibrated to the sim, you really can kind of feel the car. It's very odd. You feel it just through seeing and very slight nuances. It may take too long for some to actually get to that point, but it's quite incredible, and it's very drivable, it's very controllable, and something that's honestly a lot of fun to throw around for some laps. So I've moved on to the site of many epic online battles back in the day. Talladega in NASCAR 1, come down into turn 3 here. Very steep banking. I don't know how many degrees it actually is, but certainly feels more steep than real life. Right on the back of Sterling Marlin here. Come out of turn 4 and just see the transitions. We got a car dive into the pit lane, almost going out of control in front. Past Sterling Marlin, come up to the famous kink. Almost hard to take flat out and lifting the throttle quite a bit to get through there. An oddly shaped track, and it's just the iceberg for the tracks that are included here, but this one was raced so much back in the mid-90s on Hawaii servers, and it's kind of Talladega, Daytona are always the popular online tracks in NASCAR games because they're flat out bump drafting. It's the kind of racing that folks like to see. Bump Jeff Gordon there a little bit, get up the outside of him. Seems the AI here set quite easy. I'm not sure what percentage I have them on right now, but quite a lot of fun to race here, even though it's nothing like the real track. We'll come out of the final corner, see if I can dive below him into the kink. You do have to get the line right here or things won't go super well. Oh, just lifting off the throttle there right up to the wall. Turning a lap at 189. Super Speedway racing in the early to mid-90s was a bit different than it ended up being towards the end of the decade and over into the 2000s. It wasn't, at this point, wasn't that huge pack racing, although they called it that in the day. You watch some of the build-ups to the races then, and they talk about how the restrictor plates and the draft and big pack racing. There certainly were, for the first few laps of the race, some of the larger packs, but things up until 95, 96 still got pretty strung out. I think in 92, Davey Allison won the Daytona 500 by like a half a lap or something. So it was still quite different than it is, or ended up being, but we'll come through the kink again. The physics modeling in NASCAR 1 is kind of interesting. There's not really a restrictor plate or anything like that as far as I can tell. You can still rev all the way up the rev range, although the setup I have on here, which is just the default one, is not actually maximizing the revs. But we're going a little bit slower than you would at, say, Michigan with a similar type of car. So maybe there is a different car overall. It's certainly not flat out, and I think there's a couple files you can change if you want to race this track like it doesn't have a restrictor plate, which I know a lot of folks did back in the day. Now, one thing you'll notice is Jeff Gordon dives to the low side here, and I think he got the Wood Brothers car behind him. So I've got no spotter, and spotter was something added with NASCAR 2, was kind of the big feature enhancement, amongst a few other things for that sim. To let the whole pack stream by on the low side and sneak in here behind Harry Gant. The spotter itself, though, at a track like this, definitely needed. And we'll see if I can make a break for the pit lane here. There is a speed limit in NASCAR 1, 55 miles an hour. Your crew is always the first one on pit road. And I wanted to bring it down here just to talk about the pit lanes. I'll pass my crew. This and all of the old NASCAR sims for Papyrus have the curved pit lanes. They weren't able to make a straight pit lane with the way the track was constructed. Not something you really notice at a track like Atlanta or Darlington or Bristol, since those are on the straightaways anyway. But at some of these tracks that had pit lanes that went through the infield a bit and had dog legs on them, it's kind of an interesting situation. One thing I always liked about the Papyrus sims was how accessible they made the garage feel. If we jump in the garage here, it's where you can change all your car settings. You can load and save different setups. The sim on its own comes with several setups per track. A fast and easy setup, named appropriately. The easy one's going to be easier to drive, but a bit slower. The fast one's kind of the notch up from that. And then your ace setup is the one when you're really good at driving, but might be hard to handle, a lot quicker though than the fast one. Also included qualifying setups, and I used to spend quite a bit of time taking a look at the different setups. If we jump back out and look at things like the tire settings, it'll bring you to that spot on the car and show you what you're adjusting. Things like stagger, it's not something you may know from other types of racing or know exactly what it does. So if you take this and pair it with the manual, and you can read about the different adjustments and come in here, see how the different setups are actually set up and learn something about how these cars work. Lots of different settings though. You got the front air dam and rear spoiler settings. You've got gear options, and kind of hidden within the suspension settings are all of your cambers for the wheels. Funny enough, weight jacks, shocks, wheel lock, things like that. So you can adjust how the weight's distributed over the car. Important things for stock car racing. So the paint shop program. This is actually a separate program that comes with NASCAR Racing. Separate executable you got to launch. The paint shop was first included as an add-on for IndyCar Racing as a part of their track expansion pack for that sim, but it was shipped with the main game for NASCAR Racing, which makes a lot of sense. I think the paint schemes in NASCAR Racing are one of the biggest parts about it. Giving folks the ability to paint their own car is so cool. So you launch the application separately when you exit the sim. It's not integrated into the sim. I don't think they did that until NASCAR 2. There's two main modes to it. You can either paint cars or swap cars. Swap cars lets you pick a given paint scheme and swap it with another one. So you could either make your car one of the other drivers, or if you're building a whole car set out and would rather have Sterling Marlin's scheme be the first one in the set for some reason, you could do that. And like I said, where the smaller tracks won't let the full field race and will drop the further down drivers in the grid, you might want some of those to be up front. The real event was in the painting cars menu, and this is pretty much a full paint shop. If we jump over to our car here, actually let's take a look at maybe Rusty Wallace's, why not? We jump in, it features somewhat of a Microsoft Paint style program where we have our palette of 256 colors, a few different tools to change and draw different types of lines, maybe add some text. Maybe I want to make this car into the Miller car. So I can take the black paintbrush here and try to delete some of these Ford logos. Don't need that. Then maybe we could take some font and try to make ourselves a Miller logo. Everything just seems to fit perfectly. I remember this being a lot harder than it's looking like here. Of course, this is not very accurate compared to what you'd want. But there we go. Got ourselves a nice Miller car now. So you could obviously paint inside of the paint shop here itself. And they included also a bunch of logos. So if we wanted to put some different logos on the cars, we could, I guess, stamp them with some of the sponsors included by default, or some nice flames and purple goo. All of that was way above my head back when I played this, but the real feature was this import and export feature that allowed you to export the paint scheme, and it would dump it into a PCX file that you could then open in your favorite graphics editor, Paint Shop Pro, or whatever you had at the time, and could do the paint schemes in there, edit them in there, and then import them back. That really opened the doors for the graphically skilled to customize all of the cars and start producing different car sets for different seasons. something that you still see uploaded every day to Trading Paints for iRacing or all of the different NASCAR 2003 subforums. So NASCAR Racing from Papyrus. Although the subsequent versions improved on nearly every aspect of the sim, the backbone was here for an excellent racing simulator. There aren't too many big features missing from the sim overall. I think Spotter was one of the most requested things, more accurate versions of the superspeedway tracks, and of course, tracks like Daytona itself were the things on the top of the list for reviewers at the time. But it really was a very complete sim and gives you a picture of how polished games were coming straight from version 1 back in 1994. So I hope you enjoyed this unboxing and a small review of NASCAR Racing. I've done some races in the past, but hope to do some more in the future as well. If you enjoyed this, let me know. I'm always eager to add a few more big boxes to the collection. But thank you for watching. This has been GP Laps, and I'll see you all again next time.